there was one church that caused Paul to pull his hair out and made him age before his time, it was probably the Corinthians. Paul spent an initial 18 months with them, established them as the church of God in Corinth. He made at least 2 further visits to Corinth, the first of which did not go very well. He wrote 4 letters to them, 2 of which we have in our own New Testament, and all of them dealt with deep problems arising among the Corinthian house churches. His co-workers, Timothy, Titus, Apollos, also visited the Corinthians, often relaying to Paul news of a deteriorating situation. The problems were numerous: deep divisions, sexual immoralities, suspicion towards Paul and his motives, plus visiting super apostles touting their own credentials over and above Paul. This was a church experiencing a mixture of social, spiritual, and sexual problems that pitted members against each other and the congregation against Paul. And yet, we see in these letters the true heart of Paul as a pastor. We observe Paul not giving up on this problem child congregation and always seeking their good and thinking of their welfare. In Paul's mind, he became a father to the Corinthians through the gospel. He constantly affirmed his love for them. He did not shrink from discipline nor hesitate to make correction where necessary. These letters are a testimony to Paul, not just as an apostle and a theologian, but as a pastor, caring for his converts with a deep and lasting love that would not give up. The city of Corinth was the capital of the province of Achaia. The city was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC, but was rebuilt by Julius Caesar in 44 BC and colonized by Roman freedmen from families with connections to the Eastern Mediterranean. It grew quickly and soon recaptured its former prominence in the region. Corinth was a hybrid of Greek and Roman cultures. The Hellenistic Corinth of previous centuries was now a thoroughly Romanized city with a Roman administration and filled with Roman architecture. Luke reports a Jewish synagogue in the city, and a Jewish presence is confirmed by Philo. Corinth was also a city with a very transient population, with people frequently passing through from merchants to philosophers, and its economy was largely dependent on the services it offered to its many travelers. Corinth was, as Champion Rosner say, prosperous, cosmopolitan, and religiously pluralistic, accustomed to visits by impressive traveling public speakers and obsessed with status, self-promotion, and personal rights. Paul arrived in Corinth around 50-51 AD. He spent 18 months in the city. During that time, he met Aquila, a Jew from Pontus, and his wife, Priscilla. The couple were tent makers like Paul and had recently been in Rome until they were expelled by the Emperor Claudius's edict exiling certain Jews from the city in 49 AD, most probably on account of disputes about Jesus as the Messiah in Roman synagogues. Paul spent some weeks speaking in the synagogue, but was eventually forced to leave, and thereafter took a mixture of Jews, God-fearers, and a significant number of Gentiles and formed a network of house churches in Corinth, which he led for 18 months. The Jewish residents hauled Paul before the governor of Achaia, Gallio, whom we have a famous inscription placing him in Corinth in 51 AD. And you can, to this day, see the bema or judgment seat where Paul was brought before him. The Jews complained that Paul was inducing other Jews to an unlawful form of worship. Gallio was indifferent to the matter, regarding it as an internal squabble, and he refused to render a verdict. He showed no concern even when Sosthenes, the synagogue ruler and one of Paul's converts, was beaten in broad daylight. Paul remained in Corinth for a short time, but soon departed for Ephesus on the way to Jerusalem and Antioch. After Paul left Corinth, the Corinthians were visited by Apollos, a Greek-speaking Jewish Christian and an associate of Aquila and Priscilla. And maybe even Peter passed through Corinth on his way to Rome. While all these visits benefited the church, it also divided the loyalty of the congregation around certain personalities. And the situation was compounded by the persistence of pagan sexual practices among them. It was when Paul arrived back in Ephesus from Syria that he received reports about what was transpiring in Corinth. He subsequently wrote a letter to the Corinthians where he urged them not to associate with believers who engaged in blatant sexual immorality. Paul was then prompted to write another letter, that's our 1 Corinthians, from Ephesus around about 53 AD, which was delivered by one of the household leaders who had visited Paul in Ephesus. He wrote in response to two things. First, to answer several written questions from the Corinthians about marriage, celibacy, food sacrificed to idols, spiritual gifts, the collection for the saints in Jerusalem, and the prospect of Apollos' return. Second, he also wrote in response to disconcerting news from Apollos and several house church leaders about factions, incest, lawsuits, women dressing in culturally inappropriate ways, disorder in worship, and even denials of the resurrection among the members of the church. On hearing from Timothy that his instructions had not been heeded, Paul then made a second visit to Corinth, which he later called a painful visit, since it sullied his relationship with the Corinthian church. Paul returned to Ephesus and wrote a letter of tears, which had a powerful effect on the Corinthian church. Titus later met up with Paul in Macedonia, where he reported both good news and bad news to Paul. On the good side, that the Corinthians had dealt with the leading antagonist who was fomenting opposition against Paul, and the Corinthians had reaffirmed their affection for Paul. On the negative side, Titus also informed Paul of the arrival of certain super apostles who had disparaged Paul's ministry as inferior to their own. Paul composed 2 Corinthians, probably from Macedonia, around 55 AD, to celebrate their reconciliation to him, to give instructions for Titus's visit to take up the collection, to prove that he was not inferior to these so-called super apostles, and to prepare the Corinthians for his third visit. There are several critical issues that merit discussion in the Corinthian letters, including the root of the Corinthian problem, the integrity of 2 Corinthians, and the identity of the so-called super apostles. First, what was the root of the problems in Corinth? A generation ago, the verdict of scholars was that Corinth had imbibed an incipient Gnosticism, a view rightly rejected today as both inaccurate and anachronistic. More likely, many of the problems emerged from the intense factionalism within the small Corinthian church that mirrored the competitive culture and rivalry and personality politics that was nasty but normal in Corinth. Paul's primary thesis in 1 Corinthians is detected in his appeal for unity, where he says, "I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there would be no divisions among you, but you may be perfectly united in mind and thought." Paul then proceeds to attribute slogans to these various parties. I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, I follow Cephas or Peter, I follow Christ. It's unlikely that the sloganeering represents precise parties, but more probably signifies tensions, personal loyalties, and bickering within the Corinthian assembly. Paul's response in 1 Corinthians, at least chapters 1 to 4, rebukes these rivalries by replacing their obsession with wisdom and power with a theology of the cross, whereby human pretentiousness to greatness and knowledge are exposed in light of the cross, and it's all regarded as a mere folly in comparison. The main point is that the intense rivalry which typified Corinthian culture should not characterize the church. All in all, Paul urgently wanted to teach them to think of themselves corporately, individually, and cosmically in a more thoroughly Jewish fashion, in terms of the great Jewish stories of God, Israel, and the world, and that they would be ever mindful of the future judgment of God. Concerning the identity of Paul's opponents in 2 Corinthians, the so-called super apostles, this is debated. And proposals have included, Jewish Christian proselytizers, Gnostics, pneumatics, sophists, or a combination of any of those. So just who were they and what did Paul object to in their message? Now, Paul does not engage in the same kind of combative polemics as he does in Galatians or Philippians, where clearly he was concerned about Jewish Christian interlopers who could try to compel Christian Gentiles to be circumcised and to follow the law. Paul does not rattle on about works of the law or circumcision, or deploy arguments from Genesis 15 or Habakkuk 2 about the sufficiency of faith. The most likely scenario is that some Jewish Christians have arrived in Corinth who boasted of their privileged status as Jews. They claimed to be apostles, servants of Christ, and ministers of righteousness. They carried letters of recommendation. They boasted their accomplishments in comparison to others. They alleged that Paul was an impostor who was transgressing on their apostolic turf. And their criticism of Paul met with misgivings among the Corinthians that Paul lacked eloquence and personal authority. They either claimed to be or were heralded as super apostles who were more than equal to Paul. Most likely they were not Jewish Christian proselytizers. They weren't trying to circumcise and impose the law on the Corinthians too much. But they were more sophistic and sapiential in their manner of persuasion. That is, they appeared to be Greek-speaking Jewish Christians reared in Hellenistic rhetoric and wisdom. And they began disparaging Paul for his inferiority, for his manual labor, his refusal to accept payment, while they were boasting of their own superiority over Paul. And Paul, in response, claimed that these super apostles peddled the word of God for profit, and they distorted it. They were, in fact, a satanic deception, preaching a different Jesus, a different gospel, and belonging to a different spirit. While these interlopers might identify as servants of righteousness, Paul reasons that they were actually servants of a deadly and defunct phase of Israel's history. The Sinaitic legislation, with a letter that kills, a ministry of death and condemnation, and a glory that has faded and is inoperable. In contrast, Paul and his colleagues are servants of a new covenant that brings life through the Spirit. There is a ministry of righteousness characterized by a greater and everlasting glory. Paul and his circle do not commend themselves, but they proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. Their commendation is from their character and from the Lord. And that is notwithstanding the fact that the Corinthians themselves are Paul's letter of recommendation, and they themselves are proof of God's power working through him. In addition, the interlopers are trying to poison the Corinthians against Paul, and the Corinthians unwisely put up with being enslaved, preyed upon, exploited, flattered, and abused by these persons. Paul claimed that what sets him apart from these interlopers are his apostolic sufferings in human weakness and apostolic signs of divine power. These verify his divinely given ministry as an apostle. Third, there is also the issue of the integrity of 2 Corinthians. The letter divides into 3 clear yet disjointed sections. Chapters 1 to 7, which is Paul's explanation of his apostolic authority. Chapters 8 to 9, Paul's summons to complete the collection. And chapters 10 to 13, Paul's defense of his apostolic authority again. Not only is there a lack of connection between these sections, but even within them, there appear to be some discursive interruptions. Also, the tone of the letter oscillates from conciliatory to polemical. Now, given this, it is no surprise that 2 Corinthians has been regarded as a composite document, spliced together from 5 or more separate letters. While the composite letter thesis accounts for the disparate nature of Paul's argument, again, it is far from certain. We lack any textual evidence from the manuscript tradition that a shortened or abbreviated form of the letter ever circulated. In addition, we have to wonder why an early collector of Paul's Corinthian letters could not retain them as individual letters, and why he or she felt motivated to amalgamate these letters together by artificially clipping together the torso of Paul's correspondence, but then further dividing up the material and interspersing some parts with little effort to smooth over the abrupt seams. A plausible, though admittedly unprovable scenario is that Paul wrote to Corinthians over some time while in Macedonia. He began it by describing the crises he faced in Asia. Concurrently, Titus arrived to report news of reconciliation and trouble with the arrival of the super apostles. And that led Paul to write an expansive and wide-ranging defense of his apostolic ministry. Along the way, he made several digressive remarks about the dangers of idolatry and sexual immorality. He supplemented his composition with a half-written letter about the collection that he had near ready. And towards the end, he launched into a final outburst against the super apostles, and then closed with instructions about his impending visit.
If you skim through Paul's first letter to Corinth, it'll read a bit like a shopping list of questions you might want to ask your apostle. What should we do about personality cults, sexual ethics, food associated with pagan temples, how we should celebrate the Lord's Supper, spiritual gifts, the question of the resurrection? That's a fair impression at one level. Paul does indeed address those issues and more. But there are 5 threads, silken strands of biblically rooted theological thought, which, woven tightly together, hold the entire discourse in place, like a single jeweler's rope displaying carefully arranged pearls. The first thread is the shocking message of the crucified Messiah, a scandal to Jews, says Paul, and folly to Gentiles, but for those who are called, God's power and God's wisdom. The central fact that Paul wants the status-conscious Corinthians to remember is that their very existence hangs on something which their neighbors are bound to regard as sheer stupidity and which their Jewish friends down the road will see as blasphemous nonsense. The word of the cross, as he puts it, works its way through the whole letter, coloring ethical and practical teaching all the way. The Messiah died for our sins in accordance with the Bible, as he says in chapter 15, that's the start of the official tradition, which Paul finally quotes, and the cross remains central throughout. The second thread through this letter is the claim that through this crazy message, a different sort of wisdom has been unveiled, and with it, a different kind of thinking. We have the mind of the Messiah, Paul claims in chapter 2, though you have to work at it, because he says in chapter 14, in your thinking, be grown-ups. Ordinary ways of thinking and behaving require thorough revaluation. Jesus' death and resurrection and the gift of the Spirit have introduced into the world a radically new way, a new mindset. The third thread is the consequent call to unity. A bustling city like Corinth had many social divisions, and personality cults were a natural outgrowth of different social expectations. Divisions between rich and poor would show up embarrassingly at the Lord's table. And it's easy for different spiritual gifts to become status symbols, and so on. Paul says, all such posturing must go. There is one body of the Messiah, chapter 12, and each believer is a limb or an organ within that body, and all have their parts to play. None can do without the others. And that's why Paul follows that point with the matchless short poem about love in chapter 13. The fourth thread running through the letter is the parallel call to holiness. Various lifestyles common in a city like Corinth, where everybody does it, are simply out of the question for those who, he says, have been bought with a price, purchased away from dehumanizing practices. Chapters 5 and 6 are particularly clear on this. Marriage and sex are vital areas requiring careful practical and pastoral advice, chapter 7. And the question of how to stay holy in a world full of pagan worship and practice, chapters 8, 9, and 10, is balanced with the challenge to avoid a dualism in which the world is seen as evil and we can simply escape from it. On the contrary, God made the world, the creation, and it's all good, but we mustn't be enslaved by anything in it. The fifth and final thread Paul leaves for the last, but once you see it, you realize it's been there all through. The resurrection of Jesus and the consequent revision of the ancient Jewish timetable for how God was going to put the whole world right means that one must live in the present in the light of that ultimate future. Your body will be raised, so what you do with it matters now. The work you do in the present is not wasted. There is, in other words, continuity between the present and the future, as well as the radical discontinuity marked by a new world in which death will be no more. Paul's second letter to Corinth, that is, the second letter as we now have these letters, there seem to have been others which haven't survived, the second letter, as we call it, is about as different from the first one as it could possibly be. In the first, Paul seems to be on top of the situation. He's working his way through quite different topics, like a skilled handyman going around the house and fixing lots of different problems. The house and its occupants will be in bad shape if these problems don't get fixed. But in the first letter, Paul is up for that task. And now in the second letter, it's Paul himself who seems to be in bad shape. He has just suffered such a terrible time in Asia, he says, probably in Ephesus, that he despaired of life itself. Chapter 1, verse 8. Everything had gone wrong. His work had failed. His local opponents had got the better of him. He was facing possible execution. And to cap it all, the church in Corinth, called into being by God through Paul's own preaching and his tireless pastoring, had found other teachers and apostles whom they much preferred. So they told him that if he wanted to come back, he'd have to produce letters of recommendation so that they could see he was really going to be up to the job. After all, who could respect a beaten-up jailbird? It's difficult and it's ultimately unnecessary to reconstruct exactly what had passed between Corinth and Paul, between those two letters as we now have them. What matters is Paul's response, which might be classified as the foundation charter for genuine Christian ministry. Paul explains what being an apostle is all about. It means having the gospel of Jesus, the shame and the pain, the horror and the death, etched into your very soul, so that the astonishing life of Jesus may shine through, perhaps in the communities you serve, perhaps in your own life as well. This is the theme of the first main section, following the long introduction in chapters 1 and 2 up to verse 13. From 2 verse 14 to 6:12, he gets into his stride. Okay, he says, you want letters of recommendation for me? Look in the mirror. God's Spirit had worked through Paul. That's why there is a community of New Covenant people in Corinth. As always in Scripture then, New Covenant leads to new creation. 5:17. The new world has burst in upon the old one, pointing ahead to bodily resurrection. And for the moment, it's working itself out through the ministry of reconciliation, which is all rooted in the Messiah's own sin-bearing death. Chapter 5, verse 21. Having had people say that he was a poor speaker, and having argued that fine words are not the point, Paul rounds off this section with a wonderful piece of ironic rhetoric, chapter 6, verses 3 through 10. Then there's a short passage on marriage, 6:14 to 7:1, which gives way to a sigh of relief. What's happened is that while he's writing this letter, Paul is on the road, and he's arrived in Macedonia, and his friend Titus has come back from Corinth with good news. The mood has changed. And this prepares the way for chapters 8 and 9, in which Paul is delicately urging them to be ready with money for the relief effort that he's making on behalf of Jerusalem. Then he returns to the fray. Chapters 10 to 13 are a direct attack on the shadowy opponents who have been seducing the Corinthians with their super-apostolic style. And here again, Paul's rhetoric takes flight. He boasts of all the wrong things. Okay, he says, if you want a real super apostle, I'll show you what such a creature looks like. He's been beaten, stoned, shipwrecked. He's in constant danger, working night and day, putting up with terrible conditions. And when it comes to spiritual experience, well, the thing that really mattered was that he was given a thorn in the flesh. And when he prayed about it 3 times, the word he got back was, my grace is enough for you. My power comes to perfection in weakness. This is the lesson of 2 Corinthians, both in what is said and in the way Paul says it. The servant will be modelled on the master. Paul carries the authority of the crucified Lord.
One could spend a lifetime trying to sort out the historical riddles behind the Corinthian letters, meditating on their major theological themes, exploring ways to apply their message to our churches today. Sadly, we only have time for a few short reflections. First, I think the biggest lesson of the Corinthian letters is the importance of creating a Christ culture in our churches. A recurring problem is that Christians often become mirrors or reflectors of the values and behaviours around them. Any missiologist will tell you that when a tribe or ethnic group becomes Christian, they rarely get the whole package at once. More often than not, Christianity simply becomes an add-on to their existing cultural frames of seeing the world. It can result in a confused semi-Christian worldview, or in worst cases, syncretism. It can take years or even a generation for their faith to transform what they believe about gender, outcasts, the spirit world, and how it relates to old tribal enemies. The Corinthian believers were a case study of a church struggling and frequently failing to be like Christ rather than like pagan Corinth. The Corinthian problem stemmed from the fact that the Corinthian church was too Corinthian and not Christ-like enough. Hence Paul's repeated appeal to them on the theme of imitation. Paul's theological and pastoral exhortations are about creating a different culture in the Corinthian church, one characterized by the cross, by grace, love, and reconciliation. And that's our task too, turning our churches away from idolatry and worldliness and turning them into a community of former Gentiles who are shaped by the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. Second, these letters show that Christian service takes place in a series of strange paradoxes involving power in weakness, triumph in tragedy, strength in vulnerability, and death blossoming into life. Paul's most profound summary of Christian ministries is with these words: "We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you." Pastors and servants of Christ's body are a personified passion story. They are a walking and talking parable of Jesus' death and resurrection. And they are the proof that God uses death, vulnerability, and weakness to bring about life, hope, and triumph. They are outwardly battered and bruised, but they are inwardly renewed, which is why they can rejoice with thanksgiving even amidst intense hardship. To the world, they smell of death and defeat, but they are really spreading an aroma that brings life. To the cultural elites, they look pathetic and defeated, but in reality, they are champions of God's kingdom. To the sophistic professors, their message sounds foolish and dishonorable, but in God's eyes, they embody his wisdom and righteousness. To the political powers, they are the scum of the world, but in God's design, they are the ones upon whom the end of ages has come. They are jars of clay, concealing the all-surpassing power of God. How can this be? And Paul himself asks. Well, he answers, all this from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation.